Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Cyber Threats to the Electric Industry. My name is Carol Oth, and I will be monitoring the webcast. We're here with Katie Nickels, Rob Lee, and Tim Conway. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Katie, and she can get started.
Thanks so much, Carol, and welcome everyone to the first ever SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. We are so happy that you're here to join us. I am Katie Nickels. I'm a SANS instructor for Forensics 578 Cyber Threat Intelligence and also Principal Intel Analyst for Red Canary. Really excited to be joined in just a few minutes by our guest speakers today, Tim Conway and Robert M. Lee. So with that, let's get started. What are we doing here? Well, this is the first ever STAR webcast, as we call it. Our goal here is to inform you about the threat landscape, whether that's an industry-specific view, whether it's on malware, whether it's on groups. So we bring you different voices every month. This month focusing on the electric industry. And the goal here is to make sure you're up to date on what's happening with the threat landscape to inform actions you can take. So that's what we're doing here. A couple logistics. If you have questions, you can enter those into the questions window and go to webinar. And of course, everyone wants to know, can I get the slides? Can I get the recording? Good news, yes, you can. On the link, the page where you registered, you can get both of those, and we'll have a link at the end of this as well to remind you of that. So we're going to divide today's webcast into three key parts. First off, I'm going to give you a rundown, a few quick hits on things that are happening in threat news. Then we'll dive into the bulk of our webcast, turn it over to Tim and Rob for a deep dive on the electric industry and threats there. Then we'll give you a wrap up, give you some takeaways and action items for you to go do, because that's the whole point of this. So starting off, I wanted to, at the beginning of each STAR webcast, give you a rundown of what different analysts are talking about with regard to threats. Now, there's things like SANS News Bites, lots of different newsletters you can use. So it's not meant to be everything you should possibly read, just a few key trends and things I've heard the analysts are talking about. And if you're watching this later, you can tell us how we did. The date is February 12th. These are some of the things that I feel like people are talking about or interested in right now. Does that change over time? Let us know if you're a future watcher. The first one I've heard from folks, January was a little bit rough. 2020 got off to a difficult start. Rick Holland had a good tweet summarizing kind of all of the InfoSec news and things that happened, some 0 days, that Citrix vulnerability, some escalating tensions between Iran and the US, Jeff Bezos' phone, ton of different stuff in January. So I know myself and others are trying to take a breath from a crazy start to 2020. We'll see. February is busy, but maybe not quite as crazy as January. Selfishly, the next one I wanted to highlight in the rundown is the new indictment that came out on Monday. I am super interested in indictments issued by the Department of Justice. This one was on the Equifax compromise, suspected PLA actors behind that. I think indictments are a great thing to look at for different adversary techniques, as well as thinking about kind of the influencing. How do states influence each other? And indictments can be one of those tools. So really interesting to see. And of course, anytime there's an indictment that pops up, we all kind of question, what's the point of this? Is this actually changing adversary behavior? So it'll be interesting to watch that and see if this indictment, like many of the others, has any influence on Chinese adversaries or any others. Next point I wanted to hit, ransomware. I feel like every day there's another article, another blog post about ransomware. Just this week saw Children's Hospital in Massachusetts got affected. Pretty awful there, but a lot of new ransomware samples that have been popping up. Snake is one. Of course, we have kind of our traditional ones, Ryuk and others. So, and from a threat perspective, this is pretty interesting because so often, we're affected by thinking about Iran or other advanced adversaries, but ransomware is a real threat to almost every organization. So my advice to any threat analysts or anyone monitoring networks out there, don't discount ransomware. And we have some links at the end of the webcast to some of those blog posts about new ransomware variants coming out. Last point I wanted to hit. It's interesting because at the beginning of January, I know myself and a lot of others were pretty concerned about Iran. Pretty worried about were Iranian adversaries going to respond to the killing of the general with kinetic, with cyber action. no one was really sure. And I think initially we heard a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in early January about what to expect, which I know Tim and Rob are going to touch on a little bit. And what we've seen, I think, is a couple of interesting articles, blog posts that have come out about different Iranian activity. Just one this morning, FireEye posted about some Facebook activity, but a lot of that, from my perspective, happened in the fall or earlier. So it's been interesting to watch. Maybe we haven't seen a huge response in terms of cyber means. Will we? Hard to say, but analysts that I've talked to, I think we're not, resting on our laurels. We're staying vigilant, but realizing, adversaries respond at the place and time of their choosing, whether it's against the electric industry, industrial control systems, or other sectors. So with that kind of wraps up some key themes that we've seen in the threat landscape for February 2020. With that, let's turn it over to Tim Conway and Robert M. Lee. Tim is the technical director of ICS and SCADA programs at SANS, and Rob's a SANS senior instructor, as well as a course author and the CEO and founder of Dragos. They're going to be diving into cyber threats to the electric industry. I'm sure they'll touch on Iran and a lot of other issues. So with that, I will turn it over to Tim and Rob.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thanks for having me on this, the new STAR Threat Analysis Rundown webcast. I'm hoping these start a long tradition of amazing resources for the community. Today's topic, and I think future runs of these will be less industry specific, but this one is kind of unique in regards to the amount of activity that's occurring, being talked about in the media, being talked about in Washington, D.C., just about the cybersecurity and the current state of the electric system within the United States and North America, and some of the threats that it's facing. So I'm going to move into a couple of items right off the bat. Coming from the perspective of an asset owner and an operator working at a utility for a number of years, these types of headlines that you're looking at, you can think of these as kind of threats and intel for leadership at organizations. So often we look at this from the perspective of practitioners, some of the indicators of compromise, some of the activity groups that Rob's going to talk about that he's tracking, very, very specific information for people who work at the network levels in IT and OT of what to go hunt for, what to go look for, and how to help defend the organization. But these headlines are what the leaders of these companies are seeing. And they will immediately create a whole stream of work for the practitioners at the organization when these headlines come out in regards to, are we seeing any of this activity? And if we're not, why not? Is it because we're not looking? Or is it because we don't know what we're looking at? Or is it because it's not happening? So those types of discussions will automatically occur as soon as one of these headlines go out. And it's with this STAR broadcast kind of focusing on the electric sector. I know some people are here, obviously, with a background in the electric sector, but others are not. So I wanted to talk about just kind of three headlines that I grabbed about three different events. So the first, the one that Katie had led into in regards to the Iranian possible activity. So other than traditional kind of nation state activity that is occurring all the time to a number of companies across the board constantly, looking to quotes that are coming out like this one specifically, Iranian hackers could instantaneously shut down an entire power grid. That alone, we'll pause with that statement for a second. Moving into the next one from Wired in regards to an unprecedented cyber attack that has hit the United States, specifically some electric utilities in the West. We'll talk about what that means a little bit, but talking about that event as a unprecedented first of its kind event that occurred targeting the electric sector in the United States is how many are viewing that. And moving over to kind of a response and the need for change, this U.S. government makes a surprise move to secure the power grid from cyber attacks. That is in reference to the Senator King and Risch bill that has been approved, looking to dumb down the power grid and remove some of the automation and move more towards low-tech systems, manual controls, and human operation.
Tim, as Mike would say, it's not dumbing down, it's next generation non-digital assets.
Yeah, next
not analog.
Next gen. it's it's a move away from the smart grid, so you can use whatever word you like. So taking these into account, and from the perspective of a leader at an organization, seeing these headlines, you would go to your teams that are looking at the normal threat intel, data feeds from companies like Dragos, from other providers, where they are going to be looking at a practitioner level, but now they're being asked from above, is it possible for a nation state like Iran to instantaneously shut down the power grid, and our portion of that? This Wired article that's talking about a attack that occurred in the West. What do we know about that, and can we defend against it? And as actions are moving, should we be approving capital projects to continue to expand automation in the field and additional control if there's these actions from the Washington, D.C. and out east to do the opposite? So just with those in mind, we're going to walk through a very, very brief and then get into some of the more important stuff later. Quickly, as you heard and think in your mind, air quotes around this phrase, the grid. So as we're talking about the grid for North America, you'll hear a couple of different numbers. So just to be clear, when somebody like Rob or myself talks about the power system and the interconnections, when we talk about the United States, we say there are 3 interconnections: the East, the West, and Texas. And then that's usually followed by just because it's Texas. So there's an Eastern interconnect, a Western interconnect, and then there's Texas. All 3 of those interconnections, a synchronous AC system with DC ties between them. So direct current ties between the East, the West, and direct current between East and West and Texas. When you hear people talk about 4 interconnections, that's when they're talking about North America. So they're including the Quebec interconnection. So whenever there's an article about the grid is under attack, there is no such thing as the grid within North America. There are numerous interconnections, and that is the first layer that you have to understand, is that this large machine built, that is the electric system that is across this continent, is divided up into those 4 sections. Within those 4 sections, this other graphic to the side here, it's made up of many different components. So generating stations, and even that statement alone includes a variety of different types of generation resources. That it's not one thing, from renewables to solar to wind to thermal to natural gas, lots of different types of generation resources, nuclear included. That goes into the transmission system through step-up transformers. And again, the transmission system isn't a thing. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of substations, switch yards, miles and miles of transmission lines, all at various voltages for a very specific purpose as it's been designed and engineered. These numbers that you see in here are 765,000 volt, 500,000 volt, various voltages. Eventually it gets to a distribution element where it's stepped down and it services local customers like your homes, businesses, or industrial environments. These elements are made up of about, on the bulk electric system side, so everything that is over 100,000 volts are made up of over 1,500 different registered utilities. That does not include the distribution utilities, which is another couple thousand. So the number of companies that make up this system is in the thousands.
Hey, Tim, we had a good question coming in from Vic online. He asked, doesn't each power company own and manage its grid and is unaffected by other power companies? So I think that relates to what you were talking about. Kind of how do those companies relate to each other? Are there, Can we think of them as small grids in each company?
Yep. So looking at this from kind of the Nuance side, with the talking at just the electrical flow first is kind of where we're at now. So each company within an interconnection does have dependencies and ties at a voltage level, at a megawatt level, at a power flow level to the other companies within that same interconnection. Moving beyond that into the cyber assets is where we're heading next. So from an electric grid perspective, you have multiple interconnections, you have multiple assets and different levels of assets, and thousands of companies that own and operate those assets. So speaking as if the grid is under attack, you would have to consume all of this for that to be accurate. Or a power event that occurs to black out the nation, it would have to occur in these 4 different interconnects across all of these different types of assets to achieve that effect. Moving into the cyber component that a lot of these things are running on, And this is where a lot of the confusion comes in, is that with every one of those thousands of entities, they have, like every other company on the planet, an entire business ecosystem. Within that business ecosystem, you have all the traditional things from back office, customer payment, payroll, internet-facing websites, accounting, HR, billing. You also have some operational specific things that they do as a company, meaning they have to read meters and bill their customers. They have to have some design and engineering teams. They have to have some research and development, energy efficiency teams. So based on the business they're in, all of those things being on the business side, relying on traditional IT assets. And those things are being targeted and attacked routinely like any other business, whether it's finance, whether it's retail, whether it's e-commerce. So the electric utilities run businesses just like everybody else, and they're being attacked and targeted just like everybody else. So when somebody gets a spearfish into the business environment of an electric utility and is able to exfiltrate data, that should not be viewed as an attack against the electric grid. Number one, after this webcast, you should know there's no such thing. There's many interconnections and many components that comprise it and thousands of companies within it. And a business-based attack is not an attack against the electric grid. Moving over to the other side of this split domain, these utilities exist for the purpose of providing safe, reliable, affordable power. That is where the field assets come into play, from generation, transmission, distribution, and overall wide area control. A lot of those actual functional elements occur through these final control pieces, which is where the operational technology and industrial control systems come into play. That is why there's a number of nuances across the system that we're operating across North America to provide electricity. The way we do it across thousands of companies, the way those companies are structured from a business and a field, as well as IT and OT, all of those things have a specific amount of kind of nuance and context that matters. And it's why things like these sector-specific perspective reports are important. When I had the opportunity to read this North American Electric Cyber Threat Perspective from Dragos, that's really what started a lot of this conversation around having this webcast, so that we could focus on some of the things and recommendations and findings within that report. So with that, I'm going to pause for a bit. I'll come back later and turn this over to Rob to talk a little bit more about the specific activity groups.
Awesome. And look, I think that's a great question that we had on kind of, can you affect other companies, or are they kind of each their own little island? And it's interesting when you think about the context and discussion around the electric system or the bulk electric system, because it touches every one of us. We all care about our power industry, and so we all end up focusing on it. But the pendulum tends to swing one direction or the other. Either nothing can go wrong, we're all on our own little individual islands, the power system is super reliable, or Ted Koppel's right, we're all going to die and we should buy dry food. And it's like right in the middle. The reality is there are absolutely ways to impact major portions of the electric system in a way that would cause national security issues, it would cause major corporate issues for companies. You could realistically get to loss of life scenarios, very straightforward, but it's not easy. And I think that goes to Tim's comment on every time a utility gets a phishing email, it's not worth having a New York Times headline about it. But when we see adversaries move from sending a random phishing email to targeting a historian, or trying to go after the supply chain and actually hitting an original equipment manufacturer, OEM, or once they're inside the corporate networks, they try to get access to the industrial systems and exfiltrate out data that might be useful to developing an attack. What we would generally call stage one moving into a stage two attack. Those are things that we really, really want to pay attention to. So there's a lot of different ways to think about that, a lot of different ways to think about intel and threats, and it's going to be based on your requirements. But I'll talk to you about one mechanism to do that, and then it'll get us into kind of what are the threats doing today and what should you care about. So when people talk intel and they talk threat intel, those words mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And what I try to boil it down to is you have a requirement. You have a knowledge gap, you have a pain point, you have some question that's burning. And if it relates to an adversary, and their intentions or their opportunities to do you harm or their capabilities to do you harm, that analysis is going to be threat intel. That's what we care about. And so for me, as an example, I don't really care about attribution. I don't care that it's Iran. I mean, Katie opened up the discussion today saying, hey, there's this tension between geopolitical tension, and what if Iran's going to strike us back? Like, that's a really important topic, and I think that's an incredibly important topic at the national security level. Do I go to a utility and say, hey, you should be ready for Iran? No, because what is Iran in that construct? And a lot of us sometimes overinflate an adversary. It's not just Iran. Maybe it's Iran and splinter groups. Maybe it's Iran and their allies. Maybe it's private sector companies hacking with states. And it gets really, really conflated. What I care about is, hey, tell me what I'm looking for. Not necessarily who, but tell me how. What types of things should I be building defenses about? What types of things should I be able to detect and respond to? And so when we do threat intel, when we talk about threat intel, I like to use models like the diamond model. We talk about activity groups. I don't talk about threat actors or similar. I talk about activity groups. Can you tell me how this is relevant to me? Is my industry a victim? Have these threats gone after the electric sector? So that's question number one. Then if they've gone after the electric sector, kind of how have they done it? What are the type of capabilities they use? What are the type of infrastructure they use? What am I looking for? And I'm not really looking too much into technical indicators. Indicators of compromise can be useful, but they're not very transposable. So for years as an industry, we've gone towards indicator sharing, but you will find a lot of indicators are victim specific. So even with all the best intentions, sharing around indicators may not be as valuable as we'd like. And they're really, really rigid. If an adversary changes one small thing, the technical indicator is no longer valuable and it's completely within the adversary's control. So we want to get people towards tradecraft and understanding methods and behaviors instead of just indicators. Not saying indicators are bad, but we're going to get more value out of things like tradecraft. So a diamond model type analysis, the kind of stuff that we teach in Forensic Sci 78, is really to look at, okay, how can I analyze individual intrusions and extract out against that requirement that I have an understanding of the adversary's infrastructure capability and things about them and their targets. And capability isn't just malware, exploits, and vulnerabilities. Actually, when we think about the industrial side of the house, the operations technology environment, the industrial control systems, vulnerabilities and malware end up being some of the least important things. What I really care about is how can you use and leverage the behavior that's native in that environment to cause disruption. And all the major attacks we've seen on the industrial side of the house, it's not malware that's the big key. Sure, there's malware involved at times, that's fine, but it's really the knowledge of the adversaries of how they manipulated a digital relay or how they interacted with the safety system or the methods and protocols and communications they use to abuse that native functionality. So we want to extract that out. So when we talk about activity groups and the ones that we're going to get into here, we might say things like, hey, there's some North Korean state interest here, or maybe they're operating in what we perceive to be the Iranian state interests. I'm not saying it's Iran, I'm not saying it's North Korea. I'm saying, hey, they're flaring up while there's tension between Iran and the US. So you should prioritize this group, regardless if it's Syria or China, it doesn't matter. They're active, and here's the kinds of things we're doing. So we can say, look, this is targeted, like Covellite as an example, is one group we track. They're using legitimate infrastructure compromised by the adversary. So not necessarily like dynamic DNS, not their own command and control addresses, but things that might have been legitimate in your network traffic logs a month ago. They're compromising and using those legitimate infrastructure, and they typically compromise university IP addresses. So if you're interacting with university IP addresses, why don't you go look for that and start taking a look at it? Not individual specific ones, not here's an IP address, but why don't you go look for the behavior associated with university IP addresses showing up in your logs? Or, hey, look, there's malware here that has ability to wait before it executes. I'm not telling you here's a digital hash to go search for. I'm telling you that the behavior of the capabilities they use are doing long sleep cycles to defeat sandboxing routines and anti-malware technologies that you might be employing. So I actually might not expect my sandboxes to pick up on it. I might actually expect it to detonate in the environment, wait for a while, then start activating. And again, it's targeting towards electric utilities. So I know now that if I'm in the electric utility industry, this is relevant to me. That's really what we're trying to ask. Is it complete enough to make a choice? Is it accurate enough to make a good choice? Is it relevant enough that I should care about it? And do I have the information in a timely manner? CART, C-A-R-T. It's typically how we think about measuring and thinking about intel. So how am I going to put that to work? Well, we're going to talk about a couple activity groups here in a second, and then I'm going to go into some models to use. But one of the first things I tell people is to get a good understanding of what you have. So one of the tools I'll introduce here in the webcast, and we have references for all these things at the end of the slides, is the collection management framework. I see a lot of utilities these days coming to me going, I want asset inventory. And I get that. That's cool. Like, you should totally have an asset inventory. But my next immediate question is, cool, what for, or what do you want in your inventory? And sometimes it's crickets. It's like, well, firmware. Okay, but why? Patches. Okay, but are you going to patch the digital relay? Well, no. Well, then why do you want that? And so it's not to push back anybody. It's just to try to expose, like, what do you want out of your inventory? Because remember, something like an asset inventory has got to be able to answer questions for you about what you're trying to accomplish. So let's look at what a collection management framework is, and then let's tie this together with what we just talked about in Intel. Really, the whole idea behind a CMF is not just knowing what you have, but where it's located, what type of questions you can ask of it, and where the data is being stored and for how long. So here in this kind of fictitious example, I have a control center, a common entity in the electric system. And I'm saying that in my HMIs in my control center, I've got Windows event logs, and I could totally answer questions about exploitation and installation, accident objectives types questions with that. If I really need more information, if I find something good and I want to pivot to another form of collection, I could also just grab the registry keys off the system. And I'm storing all that data in an enterprise SIM, and I've got it for 60 days. Got the data historian, alarms, set points and tags, local, 120 days. Transmission substation, can I move across? Well, I've got RTUs. And on those RTUs, those remote terminal units, I've got syslog. And if I needed to, I could also understand the controller logic itself, and it's also local in 7 days. Cool, why do I care now? Well, when I start to figure out the threats that I care about, and I start to think about the ways they're achieving their objectives in my environment, I can very easily start defining not only what my inventory is, but what I need out of that inventory to answer the questions in the face of the adversary. Or said simply, would I ever be successful in protecting, detecting, or responding to the types of things that I care about? So it's too common that a junior analyst will sit in front of a SIM, take an indicator that they find when these reports hit the news, like Tim was talking about, and they run the indicator through the SIM, and nothing comes back. And they go, aha, we're clean. When the real question should have been, did we ever have the data to answer that question in the first place? And what I found, and I'm not trying to be flippant here, what I found with a lot of electric utilities is we have the equivalency of Schrodinger's ICS. Like, we're not looking in the box to make sure the cat's alive or dead. We're just figuring, it's probably all right because the lights are on. And that used to be okay. I don't want to put anybody down, but like, we are to a place now that we are seeing enough adversary activity and we know what to do as a community that we got to get ahead of it. No, the lights aren't going to go out tomorrow across all of the United States. Yes, our infrastructure is reliable and safe, and it's awesome the work that the operators and engineers have done over the years. But equally, yes, our threats are aggressive and becoming more numerous and aggressive. So figuring out what do we have down to an actual level of being able to answer the right questions to be able to operationalize things like Intel will put us in a really good place to be secure and defensible against those environments. So let's take an example. We get to things like CIP standards. And I commonly get the question of, well, isn't the electric grid okay? Because we've got NERC CIP. NERC CIP is our regulatory standards that say that we are secure, right? Wrong. NERC CIP, fantastic mechanism across the electric sector, right, wrong, and different emotional decisions one way or the other. We're in a better place today than we were a decade ago. But that's the trailing indicator of security. It's a foundation to build off of. It's not what right looks like in the face of threats. We have that gap. I commonly say that most of our standards and regulations and frameworks as a whole were written pre-2015. Most of our insights to the threats were post-2015. Doesn't make the standards and frameworks and similar bad. It makes them really useful foundations, but it also means that there's a gap that we have to go address, and that's always going to persist where the leading edge, understanding what are the threats actually doing, what's the ground truth reality, and layering that on top of our standards, that's what security is going to really, really look like. So Tim, you've got more experience on NERC CIP than most people I know. Why don't you take us through a little bit of this, and we can get right back into the topic of operationalizing Intel.
For sure. Thanks, Rob. So the comments that Rob made in regards to aren't we good because we have NERC CIP? So this is kind of where Rob and I both start to sound schizophrenic, where we're saying, don't overreact. The electric grid is not under attack. You're not going to turn off power everywhere. And we're very specific in regards to specifying the various filters and layers of what that means, meaning the number of interconnections, the thousands of utilities, the hundreds of thousands of assets, all the different things that would have to go wrong for something to that scale to happen. And even if it did, from an operations perspective, there are multiple black start drills and exercises and restoration efforts with every entity and every region that they practice multiple times a year for the last 18 years. Moving towards kind of delayering that same from the answer on the IT and OT cyber perspective, so the digital assets that run all this stuff. Certainly, there's some way that those could be attacked. And what controls are in place? Do the utilities have a plan? And where the answer comes, yes, we have NERC CIP. We end up looking at that and saying, that's like saying the grid, meaning the NERC CIP standards are not a unique thing that applies equally to every single utility, every single asset, every single environment, and every single cyber device. And that is the piece that is often missed even from people who work in this space or regulate this space or start to look to the standards to identify what needs to change in the future to address risks and concerns. So to help understand that a little bit in the same way we went through the power grid side, very, very quickly from the perspective of NERC CIP, these are the current standards that you're looking at here, current versions and what they control. Coming up in July, we'll be adding CIP 13, which is supply chain standard. So that'll be a new entrant from a power system perspective and for the bulk electric system asset owners and operators to start developing and working with their vendors and OEMs and third-party providers and integrators to ensure that they're achieving what needs to be done for supply chain. But looking across these existing controls, the universe is covered from the perspective of a regulation and standards perspective, from the electronic security perimeter side to include physical security perimeters, asset management, incident response, recovery and restoration, configuration management, vulnerability assessments, protecting information. Everything you can think of is in here. However, where these are unique is that they were developed by the electric sector for the electric sector. So they address the risk that applies differently to a control center environment that has wide area view and relies 100% on connectivity and communications versus a power generation site that has different types of assets to consider, different types of risk, different types of impacts, could run without communication external for a period of time, and also transmission environments in regards to kind of that blend in between where they need communications in order to be remotely operated, remotely controlled, and they could potentially in a period of time run without those communications as well. So these standards had to kind of apply across multiple different environments, which is really where the sector-specific nature of the standards comes. But they also specifically apply to the IT assets that are in use at those different environments, as well as the OT assets that are in use. So it had to accommodate for the significant differences between those device types, where some traditional IT assets have full capabilities to do a variety of different controls, and the OT assets are built for purpose types of devices in many cases that do not have necessary or what some would view as adequate security controls or capabilities. The primary reason, again, is they are not built to be a security device. They're built to be an operational asset. So every cycle, every scan rate, every processor, second matters in these real-time operating system, industrial control system devices. And peeling off any of that capabilities to do some level of security packet inspection or check prior to actually doing what they're built for could cause a safety event, could cause equipment damage, could cause a human loss of life issue. So the vendors of those devices specifically, they look to the asset owner to secure around the device, meaning with appropriate perimeters, appropriate controls, appropriate access, physical, cyber, all of the above. This set of standards covers all of that. What is important for people to know is that all of these controls vary depending on what type of asset it is. So if it's a generation asset, transmission line, control center, control room, black start type of asset, some of these requirements apply and others don't, depending on what type of asset it is. So that's based on the risk of that asset to the bulk electric system. Depending on the size or capability of the asset, it gets a different impact rating. Again, that will, if it's a low impact asset, a whole bunch of these requirements go away. If it's a high impact, there's more requirements that apply based on risk. So this is, again, this path of you can't talk about NERC CIP like it's one thing, and that one thing and all of its controls will protect us everywhere. The way NERC CIP is designed and implemented is it is based on the risk of the type of asset, the risk of the impact of that asset being unavailable when needed, and then it moves down into the types of cyber assets that control it, whether they're programmable devices, if they have digital elements, and what their impact could be to this generation resource, transmission substation, or control center.
Tim, we had a question come in on NERC CIP.
Sure.
For smaller orgs that aren't required to meet NERC CIP, would you recommend they still try to voluntarily comply with CIP or use other frameworks? Our question asker said like NIST 800-82R2 as a baseline. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. If they're not bulk electric system, meaning they're distribution only and they don't fall into any of the criteria, that would put them in the category of they don't have to perform any of the requirements located within this set of controls. So they could go out and choose some other framework, some other approach. If they're in the electric sector, I would highly encourage them to choose from the requirements within the NERC CIP set of standards that apply to them. They were built by people from the electric sector. They pertain to the various asset types. And they will send them down a much cleaner path in regards to what they should do specifically if they are within the electric sector. Many organizations that are transmission, generation, control, and distribution, for an example, they've done what they need to do to comply with the standards where they need to do it. But then they choose to run that same program across all the rest of their assets where they don't have to. So the generation resources that don't meet the criteria of low, they may still perform the controls there just because. The generation resources that don't meet medium, they may choose to do it to that level just because. So they're choosing to go beyond the requirements in a number of environments just from a good utility practice perspective. The last piece to consider here is this accessibility. So how these cyber assets are reached, whether they're serial, whether they're routable, whether they have wireless, whether they have data diodes in front of them, if they're communicating in and out of an electronic perimeter, that varies what types of controls actually apply. So again, where we're trying to educate media and leadership to not talk about the grid as one thing, we are trying to educate all the people within the electric sector to not talk about CIP as one thing and assume that all controls apply everywhere, where these conversations are coming of, aren't we protected because of NERC CIP? Well, which specific controls are you trying to determine are protecting you? That's truly where looking at each of these different activity groups, understanding their behaviors, which Rob is going to talk about here in a second, and then understanding what they're doing and which controls would actually help. And more importantly, if those controls aren't in place and they fail, all of what we're doing from an electric sector perspective is in support of operations. So we should all eventually move towards an assumed breach, an assumed compromise, and an assumed impact or misuse of our assets. And then how would we direct and ask our operators to still perform their jobs without those things in place? So as Rob kind of talks about each one of these groups, I will funnel in with some discussions more from an operational perspective of how you would kind of run the system or plan if you were trying to defend against a specific activity group.
Absolutely. And again, I'll kind of delve on that and say the regulations are good. Well, I mean, again, all those that are complying with them on the webcast are like, they're good. It's good for you. It's good. It's like broccoli. It's all right. But the thing to note is you can just follow a checklist and be no better off. It's not go do the regulations and we're good. It's make sure you're doing it with the right use cases in mind, the right prevention strategy, the right detection strategy, the right response strategy in place. And that's really where kind of the threat intel piece comes in. It's really where understanding your adversary helps, because you can be compliant and not be secure, but on your way to being secure, you can also be compliant in such a way that you're getting extra value. So when we look at things like parasitic xenotime and dimalloy, these would be three as an example that were pretty active in the electric sector and all worth paying attention to. Parasite's more of a new one. It's not misspelled. Looking at parasite from the industrial minerals perspective, all of our names end up just being industrial minerals. But parasite was specifically going after VPN vulnerabilities related to infrastructure and related to firewalls and access points into electric infrastructure. So it wasn't going after just random VPN vulnerabilities. They were trying to get into control centers, substations, other electric system components, and they were doing it by compromising the access points themselves. So you'd have to think through, all right, well, one, would we be able to detect that? And go back to that whole CMF discussion, or collection management framework, like, are we collecting VPN logs? Like, how are we monitoring inside those environments if the VPNs were compromised? And you'd have to think about, like, well, where are these for us? And what happens if one of those vulnerabilities like takes down one of the access points? One of the original articles that Tim cited at the beginning of the conversation talked about an unprecedented cyber attack on the electric grid. Well, I don't want to downplay it, because technically that's true. There was an electric operations impact, but it was just on monitoring communications between a control center and a substation because of a denial of service against a firewall. There's a lot of questions being raised there about why the firewall was internet connected and why that was impacted, but it wasn't like we lost power. But at the same time, it's still important, and understanding, well, what would happen if this went down from the operations piece is pretty critical. Same thing from the xenotime perspective. For those of you that remember, xenotime was the adversary that conducted the Trisis attack in Saudi Arabia in 2017. It was the first time ever a cyber attack explicitly and specifically went after human life. The adversary tried to compromise the safety instrument system, or SIS, which is only purpose is to protect human life, not reliability, not equipment, not protection of gear, completely just about life. The adversary went after it specifically to try to kill people at a petrochemical site. Okay, but petrochemical, well, what's the big deal? Well, a big deal in the petrochemical industry, but also from the electric perspective, we've seen xenotime since pivot from just targeting oil and gas in Saudi Arabia to starting to target oil and gas around the world and targeting electric systems in North Europe, United States, and Australia. So the same adversary that's going after safety systems and trying to hurt people in petrochemical, now targeting electric infrastructure, is pretty concerning. But what were they doing? Well, right now they look like they're in the learning phase. They're specifically going after early access points and abusing all the open source information that we tend to put on either regulatory or websites related to our infrastructure, where you could have like system drawings and engineering drawings. And they were going after vendors and integrators directly to try to steal things like engineering drawings. And that goes to exactly what we're talking about, where it wasn't just a compromise of an IT asset, it's compromising specifically to get operations level information or information that would be useful in developing an ICS specific attack. And then lastly, on this slide, we had dimalloy, which did long-term persistence. For years, they were going after electric systems. Once they were getting into the IT environment, they were immediately trying to pivot into the operations technology environment. And from there, they were going into the OT environment to look at HMIs and historians and try to take screenshots of the HMIs and try to understand the logical layout of that environment. Again, an early capability, not something to scream to Congress and New York Times on and go, oh my gosh, we're all going to die. But no, they're getting the capability to do attacks. They're learning. We want to get ahead of that. Let's not hype up the problem, but let's be proactive, because we don't want to just wait for them to have that capability. We want to get in front of it. And each one of these, again, has that operational impact that Tim can kind of double click on that here in a second. But the VPN piece, understand the impact if we lose it. Long-term persistence, like where are we storing that information? Not always are we having things like engineering drawings in the engineering workplaces. Sometimes it's serviced at our integrators. And then things like Xenotime, that had a big theme of root cause analysis, where the original attack on the safety system, the operators of that plant didn't think it was a cyber attack. They just thought it was a maintenance issue. And we want to make sure that we're including that cyber forensics piece, if you will, and making sure that we have the right collection strategy and the right detection strategy to ever realize the right response and the right response strategy we're going to have, because we want the operations folks to take the right response when we actually understand things like root cause analysis. Tim?
Awesome. So with the time we have left, these next two slides, Rob and I could probably do a 2-hour talk on alone, but just quickly looking through kind of these three plus another two that are coming. Actually, if we can go back one. Looking at these three and the other two that are coming, we chose 5 to talk about here, but looking at each one of these, so Rob talked about kind of Parasite and the VPN vulnerabilities. One could easily look to NERC-CIP and say, well, hey, we've got VPN requirements and we've got interactive remote access requirements for vendors and third parties and people connecting, so we're good. And that's again diving into the questions that come along that. Where do those interactive remote access requirements apply? Are they at all low assets, which is a tremendous amount of your assets? And the answer is no. Moving up the path into mediums and up the path into your control centers and highs. Certainly in the control centers, they apply. At the mediums, it all depends on what type of communications and things that are happening there. So you've got this variation immediately where that answer of, well, NERC-CIP has requirements and controls for that isn't truly, it's got a large nuance behind it of where do those controls apply. So again, a company could choose to do it everywhere, regardless of where the standard requires and where they don't. But the piece where I really want to move is the standards are the standards, and they're very, very challenging, very difficult, very well thought out. They've been implemented over years, and they continue to get better and improve. The piece where we need to start thinking is down into the operational component, because again, everything we're doing is more as in support of operations. So to truly take this activity-based, the view that companies like Dragos are seeing, and they're alerting organizations that this activity group is escalating and they're doing these specific kind of behaviors. That's truly where you would look as an asset owner and say, so I'm hearing that this group who does these types of things and uses these approaches, the activity is escalating. So we should have an operational playbook that says we need to change our remote access groups. As this activity group is escalating, we need to reduce the number of people that have interactive remote access. We need to increase our monitoring on our VPN connectivity that we have over ICCP links dedicated site to site. So knowing that this group uses that access path, we need to reduce our risk of people who have it and it's available, and increase our monitoring where these links exist. As we move to that, as we're hearing kind of this activity group is escalating in these areas, there should be some operational response to reduce or manage that risk. If we have detection capability inside of our organization and we actually find this activity group active, then we should have a next step where we disable interactive remote access capability, because now that may be the access path for this group, and we should have some type of playbook response of what to go do while we're hunting for what this adversary has done. The behaviors being kind of modeled from organizations like Dragos, being alerted to companies, and through webcasts like this, just knowing that this activity is increasing and they're targeting your sector, there should be a direct response that is more operations focused, not just all IT and OT.
I'm going to jump in with a quick question. How do we see threats differ across different sectors? So one question we had was, for example, do similar groups target oil and gas versus the electric sector? I think, Tim, what you were saying is like looking for a lot of these behaviors, it doesn't really matter who the group is. It might work tracking them, regardless of who is behind that keyboard. But in terms of threats, do you see a lot of like cross-sector targeting within ICS, electric sector, oil and gas? Tim or Rob, any thoughts on that?
Yep, yeah, of course. So a lot of the same devices used in a lot of the same places, so capabilities can be repurposed. Groups aren't just targeting one part of the critical infrastructure, they're targeting capabilities and the critical infrastructure. The last piece I'll say before I let Rob jump in is a lot of these organizations are interconnected and interdependent. So lots of interdependence on natural gas from the electric sector, generation specifically. And then cross dependencies across telecom and power. But you'll also find the unique instance where a number of natural gas asset owners are also electric asset owners. So within one company, you've got multiple kind of industrial field environments. So it's difficult to tell if the adversary is truly targeting them all uniquely or they're targeting an organization. Rob?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll add on that to say that we track right now 11 different threats that are targeting industrial specific environments. So industrial environments specifically, I should say. So tons of stuff hits every infrastructure, that's fine, but 11 different activity groups that are specifically going after industrial controls. And 7 of those 11 are multiple industry. And so like Xenotime, as I said, started in oil and gas, but very quickly we started seeing in electric. Sometimes it's a tradecraft proliferation aspect. They actually move. Sometimes it just comes down to visibility. One of the really common issues in intelligence writ large is collection gaps. There was the Dragonfly campaign back in 2013, 2014, and Symantec ran a great report talking about electric sector targeting campaign, when in actuality, it was also hitting petrochemical and mining, but there wasn't a lot of data or collection for Symantec to be able to go and tell the story about mining and petrochemical. So in other words, where people are getting their data from, that collection guides what the story is going. So usually my recommendation for infrastructure companies is, number one, prioritize the ones that are definitely in your industry, but then look at the ones that are doing ICS in general and think about how that would apply to you anyways, and think about the types of behaviors you're seeing and what you would see equivalent in your environment, because it's very likely, just based on the data we have today, that it's already happening in your industry, but we just have collection gaps because we're not in the same maturity place of actually going in and understanding and collecting and monitoring those environments. Like most companies today are not doing industrial security monitoring. Most people will deploy something like antivirus and a firewall, and it's a good step, but you'll find that the antivirus may be actually turned off or excluding folders and file paths related, and it's focusing on things like IT malware, not ICS threats. And we're just in the beginning of that phase for a lot of organizations monitoring their actual environments. And we can see that again, kind of thinking Electrum and pricing. Electrum was responsible for the first ever cyber attack against electric transmission environments to cause power outages. This was Ukraine in 2016. So Ukraine 2015 attack against the distribution side of Ukraine, 2016 attack against the transmission side. And when you had Electrum do this, they're exclusively targeting electric and doing that. But what did they do? They used native protocols like IEC 104 and 61850 and OPC to target the circuit breakers with operations knowledge to deny power to the transmission site. So this isn't targeting oil and gas or mining, and it doesn't make sense really for that same type of attack to take place. But if I was in oil and gas or mining infrastructure, I'd say, well, what would it look like if somebody was pivoting from the IT historian into the OT historian, coming into my environment and using native protocols and functionality against my own equipment? And that's the type of use cases you want to generate. And then kind of tying it all together as we start to close out the webcast, it's exactly what I want people to do. I want them to take frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK. MITRE ATT&CK has done really good work across the enterprise community, getting them away from just indicators and focusing on tradecraft and TTPs, but also in having a single lexicon to communicate about this. Instead of saying threat detection, actually being able to say, well, what do you mean by that? And what exactly are we talking about? And they just released the ICS one. And so you can take things like the ICS one, which actually goes through the type of tactics and techniques you should be able to detect and prevent and respond to, and overlay things like Electrum and the activity group cluster, if you will, the behaviors that we saw, and go, oh, okay, well, Electrum compromised the IT historian. They pivoted through the historian into the OT. They abused valid accounts. They started getting discovery of control devices in the environment so that they could use those accounts to connect to them, connect up to proxies, as well as suppress the ability for alarms in that environment, ultimately to deploy malware, in this case, crash override, to be able to interact with the circuit breakers through IEC 104 commands to the PLCs and RTUs. Ultimately, that would be modifying the parameters there, which was trying to damage the property, while also denying view and denying control and availability to that equipment. And so overlaying how they're operating and like the steps of that kill chain overlaid against something like MITRE ATT&CK for ICS will get you in a place so that you know, how am I supposed to respond to this, which means how can I detect this, which means, okay, well, what collection do I need? Again, not just an inventory, but what do I need of my inventory to get there? And that's usually my biggest recommendation for folks, not only in my ICS 515 class, but just in my day-to-day work at Dragos, where, we're a technology company. We get called in to do bake-offs and deploy technology for ICS monitoring. And I'll have customers that will ask questions like, can you do threat detection? It's like, sure, but what are you asking for? Well, can you generate alerts? And so, well, yeah, everybody can generate alerts. Like if the competition is generate alerts, just snort any rule and we're done. That's not the question. The question is, what do you want to be able to respond to? Develop that strategy. Then that's going to drive your detection strategy, and that's going to drive your collection strategy. Don't do it the other way around, because you might spend a year or 2 or 3 putting in a collection and detection strategy to find out that it doesn't actually align with your response strategy. So use intel and an understanding of the activity groups, as well as just consequence driven of what can go wrong in these environments anyways. Think through those scenarios across prevention, detection, and response, and work backwards on the strategies that you're going to employ. And like Tim said, make sure you engage your operations and engineering staff to also have operational playbooks. Hey, in the incident response, here's how this is going to go. Here's the types of things we'd like you to do. Here's what we would want to interact with you on. And if it's cyber and it's an actual adversary doing this, well, maybe your normal recovery plans aren't going to be effective because now you're fighting an actual adversary. How would we need to adapt in the face of that? That's really where we want people to get to, not I checked the box in a regulation, but I did security right, and yeah, I'm also now compliant. Tim?
Just closing out this slide, looking at the Electrum group that's on here. So working left to right, as Rob just walked through kind of this activity group's demonstrated behavior in the past, from an operations perspective, working right to left. If this is what they've demonstrated the capability to do previously, from getting into the final control element, possibly impacting circuit breaker control, circuit breaker operations, other safety protections in the field, identifying those sites from an engineering perspective that are too important to fail. And that's where this King-Risch bill comes in regards to, you may have 5, 6, 7 different sites that are interconnection sites, intertie sites. The load being serviced there are far too important, where you may want to take as much of the attack vector off the table as possible by, quote unquote, dumbing down the grid, by putting in more manual controls, less automation at those specific sites, not the entire grid. Continuing to move to the left, you may look to how they positioned, and you may add some operational procedures in place to say, hey, when we're doing scheduled maintenance at these sites where we still have communication and control, we want to validate logic, we want to validate the configs, we want to validate the system as we're doing scheduled maintenance as part of our routines in these sites. As you're continuing to move past and you're getting higher up in the chain where they're getting access in IT environments and begin to build paths down, just understanding how you would operate without those, how you would continue to perform your tasks. As you get more activity, it's escalating, it's possibly being detected in your environment. You may move to hot sites where you have people at a primary and a backup control center in case those links go down, so you can continue to run without an impact. You may want to validate backups, kind of think from a cyber black start perspective where you could recover all of your critical devices in field, even though you may not have access to your backup servers or the config files. So have kind of a spare tire system with assets that are on the shelf ready to deploy. Again, from an operations perspective, looking at the effect that this activity group has demonstrated an ability to achieve and working right to left with your group's internal, kind of paying attention to when this activity group is escalating behaviors, and especially if it's ever detected in your environment. With that, I think we only got a minute or two left, so I'll kick it back over to Katie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim. I think it's a great note to end on, looking at past behavior to drive what you do. So wrapping up very briefly, couple takeaways. It's going to depend. Do you have ICS background? Are you in the electric industry or not? Regardless, we encourage you to go out there. If you hear terms like the grid or it's going down, be that voice of reason in the face of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And whether you're in the electric sector or not, take a look at the activity group method. There's a diamond model paper. Dragos has a page on different groups, activity groups they've created. Good thing to monitor there. Also check out that collection management framework idea, whether you're in the electric sector or not, that can be useful for you. And lastly, we wrapped up talking about those adversary behaviors. Check out Attack for ICS. There's a link there. So lots of references we've given you to take action today, whether it's the indictment we talked about at the beginning, ransomware, and if you want to get started in some of the things that Rob and Tim talked about, a couple references there for you. Of course, much more in SANS courses and lots of other resources for you there. So with that, we are at the top of the hour, so we're going to start wrapping up. Really appreciate Rob and Tim for kicking us off strong with our first ever STAR webcast. If you enjoyed this, tell a friend and let us know if you have feedback, things you want to hear, things you like, things you didn't like. You can always view all SANS webcasts, including this one, by going to sans.org/webcasts. And I'm really happy to announce that we have our next STAR webcast already scheduled for the end of March. We're going to be featuring two awesome analysts from Unit 42, Robert Falcone and Brittany Ash. So stay tuned. We'll be announcing that one soon at the end of March. With that, thanks to Rob and Tim and all of you for joining us. Until next time, take care, and we hope to see you back next month for our next STAR webcast. Have a great day.